sense of a little bit of my background? Would that be helpful? Or okay.
Yeah.
Well, I came to the U.S. from my native country, Canada, in 1985, and I've been in the U.S. since then. I was an elementary school teacher before I became a professor, so I taught grades 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 in Canada's largest public housing area in Toronto, called the Jane Finch Corridor, and I was working mostly with new Canadians, with immigrant Canadians at that time. I got involved when I was an elementary school teacher with the writings of people like Jonathan Kozel, but more specifically Paulo Freire. Are you familiar with Freire's work? And I became a student of Paulo Freire's, and I got to meet Paulo. And actually what happened was I went and did my PhD at the University of Toronto after writing a book about my teaching experiences in the inner city in Toronto. And I wrote a book trying to expose what life was like for new Canadian immigrants and how they were treated in schools. But it was a terrible book. It was not a critical book. It was like a whistleblowing book with no theoretical, no political context. And I came to regret writing that book. I felt that in some sense I betrayed the community. And it was the work and teachings of Paulo Freire that helped me understand what I had done wrong, right? What I was doing wrong, that I was missing the larger socio-political context of what teaching was all about. And so I became a student of Paulo Freire. Freire, of course, was a Brazilian educator. He was working in northeast Brazil with a peasant community, and he developed a program of critical literacy. And the groups that he was working with became highly politicized. He began to realize, I mean, let me put it this way. Freire wasn't just about reading the Word. Freire was about reading the Word and the world simultaneously. And so he worked with this group of peasants in northeastern Brazil. They began asking questions like, you know, maybe we're not poor because we're stupid. Maybe we're not poor because we just got born poor. Maybe we're poor because of certain structures, right? Structural hierarchies that prevent us from being able to feed our families adequately and able to get a decent education for our kids. Maybe there's some political reasons. Maybe there's something in it that really isn't just because we're deficient. And of course, the Brazilian government didn't like an educational literacy program that taught peasants to become empowered politically. So they put Freire in prison, and for 70 days. And Freire knew when he got out of prison he would be killed, absolutely killed. So he went into self-exile and ended up back in Brazil 17 years later as a national hero. The kind of work he did. He wrote a famous book, many books. His most famous book was called Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Very powerful book that students read all over the world in education classes. It was a book, of course, that was banned in Tucson, along with Luis Acuña's Occupied America. It was banned by the Tucson School Board when they were attacking the ethnic studies program there. I guess it was banned last year. So that's my background, comes from Freirean-based critical pedagogy. And I came to the U.S. in '85. I was at Miami University of Ohio for a while. And then during the LA Uprising in 1992, I was recruited by UCLA to work in their urban educational program. And I was there for 20 years. And it was just a pretty corporate place. But after 20 years, I felt I needed to move on. And actually, I'm in a very unusual place, perhaps for me, some people think, and that's Chapman now. And we have a Paulo Freire Democratic Project, which is very progressive. We've even got a statue of Freire on our grounds. Of course, we have a statue of Margaret Thatcher, Milton Friedman, Ayn Rand, George Bush, and not George Bush, Ronald Reagan and George Shultz. But we have Benito Juarez, right, from Mexico, statue of Benito Juarez, Martin Luther King, and Paulo Freire. So that gives you a little bit of just that nice little space. You know, you go in and you occupy those spaces and see if you can politicize them even further and create what we call spaces of liberation and transformation. Okay, that's my background. Now, the educational sector in the U.S., we're talking about the U.S. economy, represents about 9% of America's gross domestic product. So education now has become a subsector of the economy, basically. It was really interesting. I knew this was going to happen in about 1985. When I was at Miami University of Ohio, I was in an educational leadership program in teacher education. And the faculty said, you know what, we have to redesign our PhD program. I said, okay, let's use FERI, cultural studies, right? Let's focus on the political economy of education. And they said, no. We're going to invite the leaders of the corporations. Procter & Gamble is very big in the Cincinnati area. We're going to invite the leaders of the corporations to come in, speak to us, we'll have a big lunch for them, and tell us what skills and behaviors are they looking for the new generations to fill their corporations. And so most of the professors agreed, I didn't, to that basically the CEOs of corporations were going to sort of set the tone for what our curriculum is going to look like. Absolutely unbelievable. So in other words, some of us were about creating a critical citizen. They were about creating a corporate citizen. Right? Consumer citizens as opposed to critical citizens, which we tried to oppose. I was working with my close friend Henry Giroux. We were there. We ended up both leaving for all kinds of reasons. The for-profit education business is valued now, right, at $1.3 trillion. In other words, money that was supposed to go to education, right, in the public sector. The bankers looked at that and said, my God, education's worth $1.3 trillion worth of profits if we can somehow get a hold of that money. And so that's what's been occurring at least since 1985 up to the present. This notion of how do the banksters, hedge fund slime masters, and all those guys, how do they get a hold of that money? Right? And turn it basically turn it into profits for their own corporations and their own corporate-backed foundations. Education is one of the country's largest investment markets. Right? Billions is being spent on technologies for schools, computer technologies, etc., etc. Billions, while they're firing teachers and they're blaming them for the decline in education. I mean, it's just absurd. The hypocrisy is absolutely absurd. So you've got these well-funded corporate think tanks. You've got the right-wing American Legislative Exchange Council. You've got corporate elites and politicians who've created a society that has the most unequal distribution of wealth on the planet. And an economy that's basically driving 99% of the world into debt. And that's the community that wants to hold teachers accountable. So corporate reform, my argument is corporate reform is deforming our educational system. This notion of corporate reform, and you get it from the Gates Foundation and all kinds of other Walmart folks, it's dressed up in the language of civil rights. It's dressed up in the language of democracy. But it's basically powered by billionaires. And it's enabled by a corporate media culture. And the corporate media culture, of course, just simply mimics their party line. And so what we have is what we could call a corporate managerialist model for education, where the economy dictates the principal interests and aims of education. Isn't there something wrong with that? Should we allow the economy to dictate the principles of learning? What knowledge, how knowledge gets produced? What knowledge is considered of most worth? For whose interests and who's benefiting from this? You know, universities should, in a sense, take a stand against this just being sort of sucked into this sort of corporate culture. What kind of critical work can you do? What kind of questions can you ask? What kind of answers are expected? Winding down. So that foundations led by billionaires, high-tech billionaires, motivated by corporate self-interest, and their tax-sheltered foundations are reshaping our educational landscape. It's the teachers who care most about the children that they're serving, obviously, who are the ones that are being scapegoated, while the billionaires who want to reform school claim they are in it to help the children, but they're simply pocketing the profits. Now, okay, I'll just be extemporaneous here for the rest of the my position on, I worked for 20 years in an urban educational division at UCLA, right? And our mandate was, what can we do to reform education in urban education, right? In urban centers, like in cities, right? What can we do? And it was filled with very well-intentioned, brilliant thinkers. But what they did basically was they looked at the tiny little space where you could make a difference, right? Like, let's sort of change the policy, let's tweak the policies, let's make some incremental changes here and there. It was well-intentioned, very good scholars, and that's the window that they chose to look at. When I said, look, I think we should sort of broaden the window and take a look at how urban education is situated within global capitalism, more specifically neoliberal finance capitalism, then I think we'll be able to make, you know, a greater sort of, a greater impact. And it was like, well, capitalism's too broad to talk. You know, we live in a capitalist world. What's the alternative? Is the alternative socialism? And so there was this sense of resignation that let's be practical. Let's do what we can within the little space that we're given within a capitalist economy to make some changes. Now, you can't argue with that because, look, I'm for a dialectical approach. I believe that that most of the problems we have in education is caused by economic inequality. I don't believe that we can find that equality within a capitalist system. I believe that we need a socialist alternative, a democratic socialist alternative to capitalism. Worked on that. I have a foundation in Mexico. We try to work on that using popular education. I was working with President Chavez in Venezuela, late Chavez, the Bolivarian Revolution. That was, I think, the right direction. We were trying to build universities, take those universities to the people. Right? To the people. No, there wasn't Venezuela was not a socialist country, but Chavez was trying to create the conditions of possibility to make socialism possible at some point in the future. It wasn't happening. It certainly isn't happening now. But the struggle still continues there. So my position is, look, my position is a dialectical one. Some people say to me, well, Peter, are you for just reform or are you for revolution? And I will say, I'm for both. Dialectics, right, is not about juxtaposition. It's not like either or, right? Either reform or revolution. It's both and. Dialectics is about mediation. So we work to do what we can in the space we have with a larger perspective of changing the social relations of production in our society. So we have a larger struggle out there that we're fighting for, but we understand that there are limitations in the spaces that we're occupying right now, and we do what we can to expand and push those spaces, like you're trying to do here. You're all trying to do here at Cal State Fullerton. Broaden those spaces, push the envelope, create a larger vision of struggle, right? And yet work inside the system and outside the system simultaneously. It's not easy to do. Trust me. It's not easy to do. Not as an academic and not as a student. So, are there any questions? I'd love to just have a dialogue.